Butter or margarine? The eternal question. Well, before we get down to the science of this, a little bit of history. Way back in 1869, Emperor Louis Napoleon of France asked if someone could come up with a substitute for butter. Why? Because butter was expensive and also didn't travel well. And an army marches on its stomach. And butter spoils, of course, without refrigeration. Well, this challenge was taken up by a French inventor by the name of Hippolyte Mege-Maury, who knew that butter, of course, comes from milk, and milk is a fatty substance. He thought that the fat in the milk came from the fat of the cow. So what did he do? He took some beef fat, he mixed it in with some milk, he added a bit of chopped up sheep stomach for texture, tasted it, tasted pretty good. Margarine was born. He thought it needed a little bit more dairy taste, so he added some ground up cow udder. Well, by the 1870s, margarine made its way into North America, much to the chagrin of the dairy industry, because it was, of course, a strong competitor and margarine could be sold cheaper. So in 1886, Canada, prompted by lobbying from the dairy industry, passed a law to ban margarine, total ban. In the US, the same year, a tax was placed on margarine, and some states actually followed Canada's suit, and they also banned margarine. Some other states where it was still allowed mandated that margarine had to be colored, in one case pink, to make it look even more unpleasant. So the battle was on. Newfoundland, which at that time was not yet part of Canada, of course, was allowed to do whatever it wanted. And there was no major dairy industry there. So there was no reason not to start a margarine industry. And they did. They had lots of whale oil, they had lots of fish oil, and that could be concocted into margarine with a little bit of hydrogenation. And margarine was bootlegged into Canada from Newfoundland quite extensively. When Newfoundland became part of the Confederation, one of the stipulations was that it could still keep on producing margarine, but it couldn't sell any to the rest of Canada. A year later, the government rescinded that law, and margarine was allowed to be sold, but there were regulations about coloring. It was not allowed to be colored yellow, because it would then compete with the coloring of butter. So the margarine industry came up with some clever schemes. You may remember some of these. Margarine was white, and it came with a little packet of yellow dye, and you had to mix it in yourself. In another version, there was a capsule in the package of margarine, and you burst it, and it mixed in. And believe it or not, it wasn't until 2008 that Quebec rescinded the law and allowed the coloring of margarine. Of course, what we are really concerned with is the nutritional difference between these two. Well, these days, margarine is not made from cow udder. It is made, in this particular case, from soy oil and palm kernel oil. There's no longer any trans fat. That problem has been solved. So the question is, which has more saturated fat? That's the one that raises about cholesterol. Is it the margarine or is it butter? Well, it turns out that butter does have more saturated fat. The question is, how much of it do we actually consume? Well, for me, I put a little bit on a slice of bread, and I have weighed how much I put on this little scale. That's how much I put, and that is about 3 grams. So the question is, what about the saturated fat content? If this 3 grams comes from the margarine, I have about 0.6 grams of saturated fat. If it comes from butter, it's about 1.5. That is really an insignificant difference in terms of the overall content of the diet. So let me take my 3 grams and spread it on here. Is that margarine or is it butter? You decide.